invaders, right? Rapists, swarm, criminals. And the guard slash tour guide leaned in and he said, that's how it always starts. It always begins with language, the dehumanizing language. And so the framing of this conversation, folks, you are listening to attorney Jessica Zweng, who never, ever, 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 ever does interviews or video, but I've known her for 20 years. We went to law school together. Unlike me, she actually paid attention and then has used the rest of her life to actually help immigrants and marginalized communities through the law. She's a former staff attorney at the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project, which is a fantastic legal service organization that has actually worked inside the ICE-operated detention centers in Arizona before there was ICE. They've been at it for 35 plus years, warning us about what happens when you mix immigration with the criminal justice system, arm it to the teeth, have no accountability, fund it, and then look away. And then you get the war on terror, and then you get dead migrants, and then you get, dead American citizens like Renee Nicole Good and Nurse Preddy. Also, since then, Jessica has worked on some of the most prolonged and complex national parent-child separation cases, which sadly has been happening for decades. But, we got a sneak preview of it real up close with the first Trump administration. And then she's currently working in capital defense, investigating and contextualizing multi-generational life histories in order to develop stories and counter narratives to cruel and excessive punishment. Because, folks, as we're during Holocaust remembrance, I just want to say something real quick, Jessica. I remember in the first Trump administration, I went to Auschwitz, and I went to Auschwitz with a multiracial, multi-faith community, Black, brown folks. And we were in Auschwitz, and we were talking about the first Trump administration, and we were talking about the language that he was using to describe immigrants, invaders, right? Rapists, swarm, criminals. And the guard slash tour guide leaned in and he said, that's how it always starts. It always begins with language, the dehumanizing language. And so the framing of this conversation, folks, is the violence is the point, how ICE and CBP, Custom Border Patrol, are designed to harm and kill, something that we've talked about on the show with Jen Budd. But Jessica knows the system inside and out. And so I'm so happy that she has decided to overcome her loathing of the camera to actually join us. Jessica, welcome to The Left Hook for the first time.
Why, thank you, Ajay. It's very strange to hear you call me Jessica.
Oh, yeah. I've known her for 20 years. So I usually call her Zweng or Jess. But I'm trying to be a professional adult human being.
Yeah, I feel like I've graduated to a level of respect.
Attorney Jessica Zweng. Attorney Jessica Zweng, you said that you actually wanted to start by reading a 2006 Law Review article that you came across 20 years ago that predicted the moment we're in right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be really transparent that, I'm coming into this conversation with a little bit of an agenda, which is to try and help people understand that how we got to where we are today and the way in which ICE essentially is authorized to operate with such tremendous violence and disregard for constitutional protections, life and liberty, why they're an organization that operates with such impunity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, has a lot to do with the merging of sort of these concepts and constructs of criminality. And that's the rhetoric that they've always relied on. That's the untouchable rail. That continues to be part of the messaging even today, even amongst sort of the more liberal democratic constituency. And we're just never, ever going to get anywhere. We're never going to get down to the core of this until we start to understand some of these concepts a little bit more critically. So I was going back last night in preparation for this conversation, and I was looking at what in my line of work is considered a fairly seminal law review article, and it was written in 2006. And the opening to this article, it's essentially describing a fictional future grounded in the present reality of 2006. And they're not even predictions, but some of the descriptions that are included in this imagined future, like it essentially functions as like a 1984 for specifically ICE and DHS. So I thought it might be worth reading because it provides a really good frame of then like deconstructing exactly what the road has looked like to get from there to here. Um,
Absolutely. And Jess told me right before we started that, it's like it'll take 2 minutes, but I said, we have an attention span.
yeah.
3 minutes, no, but 2 minutes, yes.
All right, I'll read quickly.
No, no, no. Go for it. Take your time.
Again, like I got tears in my eyes. My heart started to pound. And that's as somebody that's been immersed in like the frontline context of these things for the last 20 years. So anyway, so it's written as a memo, a confidential master strategy memo to the president-elect, dated January 1st, 2017, entitled Regarding the Crimmigration Crisis. On the eve of your taking office, let us seize this moment to look back at the events that propelled you to this height. The citizenry of this country swept you into office with a vote count rivaling Ronald Reagan's. But those without the franchise, who nevertheless co-inhabit this country, aliens and criminals, will likely determine whether you return to office 4 years from tomorrow. The crimmigration crisis will be the defining issue of your first term. The international, again, these are made up fictional events, but the international prison riots of 2015, like the terrorist attacks in 2001, took the previous administration by surprise. The riots generated fears that the destruction in France and Australia in the 2000s could be replicated in the United States. The international reaction curtailed the freedom to travel and to transact business globally that Americans have taken for granted. For the first time, the United States was a target of economic sanctions as a consequence of its conduct towards non-citizens. The riots and the world's reaction brought impassioned calls for protecting the nation's security by completely banning immigration or by detaining all non-citizens who seek to cross our borders until they have shown they are harmless. Equally passionate have been calls for massive overhaul of our immigration policies. Some have suggested establishing a, quote, compassionate capitalist America, in which immigrants convicted of minor crimes might avoid deportation through community service in a meatpacking plant and agricultural fields. A growing minority, however, are calling for a new day for immigration policy, a wholesale retreat from the present-day merger of criminal and immigration law. As your campaign manager, optimism about the future of this country has been my mantra. As your friend, this moment compels me to speak plainly about the challenges we face. Key to the success of your candidacy was your talent for emphasizing with the passion, fueling those conflicting calls without actually endorsing any of them. We are now at a crossroads where you need to take a position. To plan for tomorrow, we must revisit the past. The 1980s saw the beginning of a dramatic increase in criminal consequences of immigration law violations and deportations of even legal immigrants convicted of crimes. As Congress swept more immigration-related conduct into the criminal realm, the executive branch stepped up criminal enforcement of immigration violations. By 2005, immigration-related matters represented the single largest group of federal prosecutions, factually true, outstripping drug and weapons prosecutions. At the same time, the grounds for deportation based on state and federal convictions vastly expanded. By 2005, the population of unauthorized immigrants residing in the United States had reached an all-time high. Political support for a legalization program was controversial. Federal financial support for state welfare programs had waned. Cash-strapped states with burgeoning immigrant populations pressured the federal government to increase immigration enforcement. The year 2006 marked a turning point in the future of immigration. The national conversation polarized between legalizing the population of undocumented immigrants and using the power of the state and the federal government to crack down on the illegal population. Our policymakers chose the latter. In 2007, Congress made a bold statement about unlawful border crossings by criminalizing all violations of immigration law. In 2008, Congress made deportation mandatory for the commission of any felony by a non-citizen, regardless of the length of sentence or particular conduct involved, doing away with the prior categories of crimes of moral turpitude and aggravated felonies. In 2009, Congress expanded the rule to require deportation for the commission of most misdemeanors, calling these gateway crimes. Deportation became the consequence of almost any criminal conviction of a non-citizen, including legal permanent residents. Immigrants who had previously been subject only to civil immigration proceedings, including tourists and business travelers who had overstayed their visas, and students working beyond allotted hours or in unauthorized employment, were newly subject to criminal sanctions in addition to removal. The changes in the law fed a powerful vision of the immigrant as a scofflaw and a criminal that began to dominate the competing image of the benign, hardworking embodiment of the American dream. In 2012, the Transportation Security Administration trumpeted the capture of 2 suicide bombers on a Toronto JFK flight. The Department of Homeland Security issued an emergency regulation mandating detention for all aliens entering the United States until the DHS, the CIA, and the FBI had determined they were unlikely to become a public threat nor a serial border crosser. Congress amended the INA, Immigration Nationality Act, to create a presumption in removal proceedings that a non-citizen who had been charged with a deportable crime posed a material risk of becoming involved in or supporting further criminal activity or terrorism. The statute required courts, at government request, to close the public criminal or immigration proceedings that might reveal sensitive national security information. The practical result was that both criminal trials involving non-citizens and all deportation hearings were routinely closed to the public. Opinions of immigration judges and federal courts relating to those proceedings were either not published or a public version was issued with sensitive material omitted or redacted. These measures remained in place even after it was discovered that the alleged bombers-to-be were arrested pursuant to a false tip from an unreliable informant. These events were not without repercussions. Applications for business visas dropped. The Wall Street Journal published an article reporting the international businesses were seeking more hospitable markets where international travel was less risky. The number of foreign students attending U.S. colleges and universities dropped dramatically. Migration scholars reported that as a result of the new laws and continued uncertainty in the visa process, many students had chosen to pursue their education in the European Union, India, and China. The criminalization of immigration law has impacted a population previously protected by significant legal and cultural barriers to deportation, legal permanent residents, and other long-term non-citizen residents. We are currently exporting large numbers of U.S. residents, regardless of whether they grew up in the United States or have ties to a U.S. citizen, spouses or children, communities or employers. The numbers of deportations has grown dramatically since 2004, when we expelled close to 200,000 non-citizens. Absolutely factually true. Media stories continue to document deportations of legal permanent residents who have lived in the United States since early childhood to countries where they know no one and have little or no familiarity with the language or culture. Okay. This past year, of the non-citizens DHS deported, just over 100,000 have been legal permanent residents. Those deported residents committed criminal offenses were sentenced to mandatory deportation. As you know from the intelligence report, these former U.S. residents have begun to organize, calling themselves the Exiles. Most seem to have as their mission mutual support and dissemination of information about immigration laws and developments. A few members, however, seem to harbor a deeper resentment, and their intentions may be less benign, though presently unarticulated. The criminalization of immigration law pushed our judicial and penological institutions to the breaking point. Immigration appeals clogged federal court dockets. The burgeoning population of detainees quickly overwhelmed the available cell space in federal, state jails, and prisons. Private prison fees spiked as a result of the unprecedented demand for prison bed contracts. In response, the Bureau of Prisons and the military undertook a quiet effort to build prison camps on 5 Army bases in the Mariana Islands, the Ivory Coast, Chile, Belize, and Israel to contain non-citizen detainees and U.S. citizens convicted of serious crimes. It was cheaper to ship detainees to these bases and house them than to build new prisons domestically. These prisons were also less likely to attract public notice. The extraterritorial
Seacoast.
Yep. The extraterritorial confinement of convicts and immigrants is exempt from judicial review under the Defend America Act of 2007, thereby easing the strain on federal court dockets and avoiding the cost of prolonged prison conditions litigation. At first, most cells in the camps consisted of large rectangles separated from one another by chain link fences. By the second year, most had been converted into cement block structures. The Washington Post dubbed them crimmigration camps. As of the end of last year, the camps housed 300,000 inmates, considerably more than the 3,000 alleged terrorist supporters that the CIA had detained abroad by late 2005. Anyway, it goes on, but
No, that's. I mean, for those who are joining us late, we have 1,100 people. They're like, "What is she talking about?" That sounds eerily accurate. This was a 2006 Law Review article that Zweng decided to read because she was preparing. Jessica Zweng is an immigration attorney who's been in this for 20 years, and that was eerily accurate. That was written in 2006, folks. And if you remember, George W. Bush was president. We were still in the throngs of the war on terror. ICE was created in 2003. The DHS was created in 2003. Right? It was necessary for protection against terrorists and villains and bad guys. You're either with us or against us. And that law review article, people are asking, where was it published, Jess?
I don't have I can. So it's written by a woman out of the University of Colorado. She's considered to be sort of the preeminent expert on crimmigration law. Her name is Juliet Strump. Let's see, I'll find the cover page in just a second to let folks know where it's published.
No, that's good to know. And it was specifically talking about the intersection of criminal law with immigration law and the criminalization of immigrants. But can you just do a quick bullet point of, she wrote that in 2006. What's happening in 2026?
Yeah. So just quickly, American University Law Review. So one of the things like there are sort of two pieces that she describes in that sort of dystopian future, right, that I think are really worth picking out. And a lot of this was actually going on back when you and I met, because a lot of this originally the architecture of what we're living in today was very much created in part and parcel with what was happening in Guantanamo, right? So the immigration system, very much like what was going on in Guantanamo, is designed to be a system that is almost exclusively under executive control. And that, right, and like what that means is that you don't have access to the federal courts. You don't have access to the judicial branch. You don't have access to the separation of powers, right? So immigration courts are under the Department of Justice, the Executive Office of Immigration Review, the trial level court, and then you've got the Board of Immigration Appeals, the direct appeal level court. Both of those are under an executive agency, the Department of Justice, right? The jailer, the policer, and the prosecutor are all ICE. They're all under the Department of Homeland Security. Within the DOJ, right, immigration judges are appointed by the Attorney General. The Attorney General has the authority to cancel, to remove any immigration judge. The AG has the authority to take any case that is before an immigration judge, remove it from the immigration judge's docket, and refer it directly to him or herself to issue a precedential administrative opinion, right? So, like, this is describing a system where it's all completely under executive control, right? The important part about that, and what is created is a system where people who are in immigration detention or in removal proceedings, they don't have Fourth Amendment rights. They have very, very limited Fifth Amendment rights. They don't have Sixth Amendment rights. They don't have Eighth Amendment rights, right? So you're eliminating all of the ways in which an individual might typically be able to get into court. So you're cutting the judicial branch out completely. Congress has the ability to legislate, but the only meaningful ways in which Congress has actually legislated has been to create statutes that have essentially continued to strip jurisdiction from the federal courts. So continue to curtail access of anybody inside this closed world of DHS, their access to get out to anybody independent outside of these closed executive agencies, right? So ICE is not just going into, and very early on, I think in 1984, there was a Supreme Court decision that out and out said ICE is under absolutely no obligation to respect the Fourth Amendment, right? They can operate completely illegally. Doesn't matter. No problem.
That was last
And
week, the whistleblower report that said that the ICE has been instructed to ignore the Fourth Amendment, and now they can barge into people's home and just take them without judicial warrant.
I mean, ICE has always done that, right? That's not new. That's the difference is whose homes they're now barging into.
Mm.
Right. So, like, there's never been a requirement for ICE to have a warrant for an arrest. There's never been any expectation that ICE is subject to the search and seizure rules under the Fourth Amendment. Like, that none of that has ever been in place. Right. And then what happens is 2003 comes along, you get the Department of Homeland Security, and you have what's happening in Guantanamo. Why that's significant is that Guantanamo is an absolute parallel to ICE and ICE detention in that you have people that are being subjected to prolonged and indefinite detention, executive detention, right? Like people that are subjected to prolonged and indefinite detention under the executive, where you've completely cut out any other mechanism of oversight or intervention, right? And so the Guantanamo cases were incredibly relevant because they were essentially all habeas cases. They were all cases that were evaluating the question of, in this new form of detention where you're essentially collapsing preventative and punitive detention into one under the executive in this incredibly closed system, can an individual who's being unlawfully detained in executive custody, do they at least have access to the right of habeas corpus to try and contest their confinement? So the early cases that were also essentially developing that law in the context of immigration, right? Those two things were ricocheting back and forth off one another. So when you and I knew each other in law school, those were the cases I was working on, were early cases establishing whether somebody who's unlawfully detained in immigration custody can rely on the writ of habeas corpus to try and contest that. In the case that I was working on, it was a United States citizen. So that's what people have to recognize and understand, right? The question that we were litigating at that point was, can a United States citizen use the writ of habeas corpus to get into federal court to contest the fact that they are being unlawfully detained in prolonged and indefinite executive custody? So, like, that's the architecture of the system, right? The other thing that happens is that you have massive infusions of money into DHS, right? Like,
How much money, Zwang, for the past
yeah.
20 years, how much money has been put in DHS, both by Republicans and Democrats?
Okay, so this will blow your mind because think about this figure in comparison to the amount of money that has now recently been appropriated, right? Like this I think will put into context what we are preparing for. So between 2003, when DHS was created, and 2021, this was the most sort of recent reliable figure I could find, the federal government spent around $333 billion on these agencies. So that's ICE and Customs and Border Protection, aggregated over a period of nearly 20 years. And it's $333 billion. Like, think about that figure over 20 years. And that includes the height of the war on terror, right? Like, and now we're talking about what, $170 billion?
With the big, beautiful bill, for those who don't know, the Republicans passed the big billionaires bill, permanent tax cuts for the rich coming at the expense of $1 trillion cuts from Medicaid. But they somehow found, wait for it, $170 billion for ICE and private prisons and detention centers. That's done.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, again, I came across that figure and I mean, that it gives me knots in my stomach. I'm somebody who's been involved in this fight for a really long time. I'm somebody who's been involved in this fight on the basis of the fact that I don't want these things to happen to anybody, but I'm also now very much thinking about my own personal security. Like we talk all the time amongst my colleagues, like they're coming for the lawyers too. It's like,
They're coming for Alex. I mean, look, folks. We're going to talk about this because we're going to take the DeLorean back to show you how this is all part and parcel of the plan. But we're looking at an agency that was created in 2003 in response to America's choice to engage in the war on terror, where Americans voluntarily gave up their civil liberties for the feeling of safety, where both Republicans and Democrats decided to fund to the hilt DHS, which houses ICE, which, according to Jess, the way she explained it, the legal framework, it's like a kangaroo court with no oversight, no accountability.
yep.
The testing ground was Guantanamo. Oh, we can do that in Guantanamo. Let's see if we could do it against these other immigrants that we don't like, even U.S. citizens.
Enemy aliens, criminal aliens, it's all the same rhetoric, right? It all defends the same setup. It all defends the same system.
And it's the same system, no accountability, no oversight, no prosecutions, funded to the hilt, trained in part by Israel. And we said, no problem. We need to secure the border. Democrats get more money. No problem. We have to go after terrorists. No problem. We need safety, safety, safety. Now, just connecting the dots real quick to what you just said, the writ of habeas corpus, the most important writ, people kind of forget, but we always try to bring receipts here. In the summer, Stephen Miller said that he tried to invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and he said, we're being invaded. And it was a rare rebuke where the Supreme Court said, no, actually, we're not being invaded. He says, no, we're being invaded. It's war. The immigrants are invading us. We have to invoke the Alien Enemies Act and suspend the writ of habeas corpus.
Right.
He did this in the summer. Can you tell people why they should care if Stephen Miller and Donald Trump are allowed to invoke the Alien Enemies Act and suspend the writ of habeas corpus? For people who don't understand this, the layman.
I mean, okay, so first of all, like, there is something enshrined in the United States Constitution, which is called the suspension clause, right? Which essentially is one of the protections that we were able to rely on in the Guantanamo context and in the context of sort of litigating some of these early immigration-based habeas cases to say, like, this is in the Constitution specifically for this reason. You cannot suspend the writ of habeas corpus because it is the ultimate final sort of stopgap measure to these authoritarian regimes, right? Like,
to ensure literally that the Gestapo can't come in and kidnap you from your home and you disappear.
Right. To ensure that when somebody is illegally seized, arrested, and disappeared into a closed system, that they have some ability to access the federal courts in order for an impartial decision maker to review their confinement, right? So when somebody has been disappeared into a shadow system, that is where the writ of habeas corpus is ultimately, at the end of the day, going to be the thing that they have to rely on.
And Dwayne, can we just remind people, it's not just citizens. The Constitution is clear. Anybody has the right to the writ of habeas corpus, right?
Yes.
Undocumented, legally here, not legally here, anybody.
It guarantees any individual sort of recourse to a court to challenge the legality of their custody, to challenge the legality of their confinement, to challenge the legality of their detention, right? So when you've got people being rounded up and thrown into camps, like, that's when the writ of habeas
Mahmoud
corpus.
Khalil, Rumeza Ozturk, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, for example.
Right. But something to keep in mind is, right, like, one of the most insidious parts of the Guantanamo architecture was, well, does the writ of habeas corpus survive when you're talking about people who are, quote unquote, outside of America, off of American soil, right? So, like, start to think about that in the context of us sending people to prisons in El Salvador. Like, that was one of the questions that remained, or that was sort of left open, or the question that, like, where Guantanamo ended, right? Like, where the court, there were essentially 6, maybe 7, like, pretty key Supreme Court cases defining this body of law, and where those cases dropped off, where that left off was leaving open the question of, okay, what about if that individual is not actually being held in the United States or United States territory?
And, what you gave me is an analogy that I've used is essentially Folks, I know people don't like hearing this. Democrats and Republicans voluntarily left a loaded gun to be
Oh, yeah.
used by a fascist. And that loaded gun was armed to the teeth by both Democrats and Republicans, the authorization to use military force. They didn't close the loopholes. They didn't engage in immigration reform because they didn't want to be seen as being weak on terrorism and weak on crime. And they just assumed that, oh, a psychopathic white nationalist regime would never get in power. But what we've been saying for 20 years, Zwang, is that this is
Mhm.
a loaded gun. And this
Yes.
loaded gun that you are firing against Muslims, Latinos, Black people, and Palestinians, this one day can be turned around and used against American citizens.
Right. And again, like I just want to emphasize there have I think people have sort of failed to understand that there have been many United States citizens that have been taken into ICE custody and that have been detained prolonged and indefinitely in ICE custody, right? There have been many Native Americans. Like, I mean, it's not an unusual, it's certainly not the majority of cases, to be sure. Like, I don't want to overstate the case. They're not necessarily overrepresented, but it happens all the time. And, if you're in ICE custody and you're a United States citizen, great, fine. That's good for you. Lovely for you. But you're still limited to the exact same pathways in order to try and make your case, right? Like, so this
I
isn't
mean,
this is an
just
abstract
look at Alex
future.
Preddy. Just look at
Right.
Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good. ICE, folks, just look at it. It's literally in our streets. ICE has been deployed by this administration. Last time I checked, there's really no border there in Minneapolis, but okay, or
Right.
Chicago or Portland, doesn't matter. They are apparently doing immigration enforcement, going against drug smugglers and terrorists. Interesting, Renee Nicole Good, unarmed white mom who had the temerity to sit there and observe, and her lesbian wife just had a little bit of snark, but Renee Nicole Good was smiling, and her last words were, "I'm not mad at you, dude." Didn't stop her from being shot 3 times as her body was still warm. The president came out, lied about her, said she violently ran over Officer Ross. They're still engaged in a cover up. Then Christy Nome, the head of DHS, came out and called her a domestic terrorist. 2 weeks later, Alex Preddy, we all saw it, literally had his phone legally there, no criminal record, 37-year-old nurse, white man. Renee Nicole Good was a white woman, had his legal concealed carry firearm, didn't take it out. They beat him, shot him 10 times. Before his body was cold, Bovino said that he was there to cause mayhem, again called him a domestic terrorist, lied about him, and are engaged in a cover up. And to that, I asked then, Zwang, because I know people are really pissed off about it, as they should be.
Mhm.
And, I've always said on the left hook, white blood matters more than black and brown blood in America. White rage matters more. White grievance matters more. But let's go back 20 years.
Yeah.
How many times have they done this to
Oh God.
black and brown indigenous people, lied about it, and then covered it up, Zwing? That's what I'm thinking about. I mean, that's what people should be thinking about, right? They did the same playbook twice in a row in 2 weeks.
I mean, this has been their consistent playbook since the inception of this agency. I mean, honestly, I'm hard pressed to come up with statistics off the top of my head. Like I think if you're talking about murders in ICE custody, right? So if you're talking, and that's just ICE, like that's not taking Customs and Border Patrol into account. But like if you're talking about just murders in ICE custody, well, I would argue you also need to think about suicides. Um, like I want to say you're probably talking about, if you're including suicides, maybe 50,000 people.
Jeez. And Jen Budd, who's a whistleblower, and she was a former CBP Border Patrol officer, she gave the number when she was on. Total number of people killed, disappeared, 80,000 in CBP. 80,000.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you add CBP into that, it's a whole other figure, right? I mean, yes.
And you saw what happened. The Cuban immigrant whose name I'm forgetting, one of our community members will find his name because I want to name these people. It's important to name them. The autopsy that was revealed just a couple of days ago is that he died.
Yeah.
Murder. Homicide. The autopsy came out. Homicide. And there's also Keith Porter, another man who was killed in the new year, a black man, but his murder wasn't filmed. So I just want people, the reason why I'm saying this, we have these two examples in front of our face in the past 3 weeks. with the same exact type of playbook: the cover up, the lie, the absolute immunity, the no prosecution. The
Right.
murderer is uplifted by Bovino, nothing wrong. So this culture of absolute immunity for violence is baked into the system.
And look, one thing I think that also really bears emphasizing is up until, right, one of the reasons that immigration has, at least in the modern era, been considered to be the exclusive purview of the federal government, right, is because of this theory that it exists under the plenary powers doctrine. Well, that, like, there's a supposition there that immigration is predominantly a matter of foreign policy, right? So immigration is really meant to be a question of of the external borders. It wasn't until I think 1917 that the idea of immigration enforcement applying to surveilling and policing the interior, right, even existed as a concept. And so it starts to look a lot more like domestic law enforcement
There
than
you go.
any that has anything than it having anything to do with with securing our borders, right? Like that
Minneapolis.
it hasn't been that for a very, very, very long time. And beginning in 1917, that's when you start seeing the language around undesirables, unfit, immoral, criminal, blah, 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 right? So it's that construct that was invented and developed to justify the creation and to perpetuate what is essentially a federal domestic interior law enforcement militarized police force that is exclusively under the control of the executive branch. Like,
To quote Zach De La Rocha, some of those that burn crosses are the same. Some of those who work forces are the same that burn crosses. And to bring it back full circle, we talked about how it all begins with dehumanization, right? You call them
yeah,
vermin, you call them scum, you call them a fifth column. They will outbreed us. Everything I just said right now, folks, was exactly what America used to describe Italian immigrants in the 20s, what
oh
they
yeah,
used to describe Eastern European Jews, what they used to describe the Irish. And in the 20s, you had this Immigration Act that essentially blocked all immigrants from Asia and from Southern Europe for 40 years until the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965. Now, Stephen Miller, who is a white nationalist, Zwing, has said that the worst thing that has ever happened to America was the Immigration Act of 1965. He is trying to end birthright citizenship. They've ended temporary protected status. They're trying to denaturalize citizens, folks. This is all happening as we're speaking, right? But you said something really important to me, that we're going to take this DeLorean back to the 20s and 30s,
hmm
and because this is nothing new, because we have to find out the genesis of all this. This is nothing new. The violence is part of the plan, right? The violence is the point. And you
well,
said
and
that
the ethnic cleansing is the point, right? Like it's the deployment of violence to the end of ethnic cleansing, and like that's not an abstract concept. Uh, I
well, no, remigrate. Did you see the DHS? DHS, I mentioned on the left hook, to your point of ethnic cleansing, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, folks, that houses ICE, 3 times in the past 2 months has tweeted remigrate. Remigrate is a white supremacist term used exclusively for the ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of all Black and brown Asian people from white America and Europe. Swain, continue.
so I actually, a dear friend of mine, a woman named Kara Hartzler, who I used to work at the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project with, she's now part of the federal defenders down in San Diego. During COVID, she started to put together essentially an equal protection challenge to what's known as 8 USC Section 1325 and 8 USC Section 1326. These are the federal illegal entry and illegal reentry statutes, right? So these are the statutes by which essentially somebody who's committed glorified trespassing, because it is specific, right? You're not talking about somebody who's in the US and overstays a visa and is therefore undocumented. Like, these are people who are crossing the southern border and become subjected to federal criminal prosecution on account of that. And I think, again, something that's incredibly critical to understand is these prosecutions illegal entry and illegal reentry, they account for something like 70% of all federal criminal prosecutions in the United States. Like
Wow.
70%. So Kara started, and I think it's also important to understand that 1325, the illegal entry statute, that was the predicate for the zero tolerance policy, right? Like that was the architecture of how we got into the parent-child separation mess. Is people who were coming across, they were charging, right? They were charging adults.
Can you remind people, because we live in the United States of Indonesia, that is the first Trump administration when Jeff Sessions was the head, and he said we're going to have a zero tolerance. Can you just, for people who forget or don't know?
Yeah, I mean, so essentially what was happening, right, is like they were um we can back up the bus even a little bit further. I don't know if like Flores settlement, if that rings any bells for people, because that was a huge talking point during the parent-child separation crisis. So the
Yes.
Flores settlement actually originated in the 1990s. It came out of this practice that had been developed of detaining immigrant children as bait to try and lure their undocumented parents out, so then the parents can then be arrested, detained, deported, right? So that was
What just happened just last week with the 5-year-old in Minneapolis.
right. So that's the genesis of the Flores settlement. So during the parent-child separation crisis, they sort of redeployed this architecture. And the predicate that they relied on is, as people were coming across the southern border, it wasn't unaccompanied kids. It was children that were traveling with their families, but they were rendering these kids unaccompanied by taking the adults into federal criminal custody and charging them with Section 1325, charging them with illegal entry, right? So now the adults are being taken into federal criminal custody. We're rendering the kids we're rendering the kids essentially as unaccompanied, and then we're disappearing the kids into the custody of what's supposed ORR, which is under Health and Human Services, right? Um,
Well, run by RFK Jr., so don't you
yeah,
feel better?
not then, but now, yes. But again, like it's sort of this ongoing fiction, like, oh, it's under the Department of Health and Human Services, therefore it's meant to be, right? Exactly. um, so I think this is another place where these ideas of fear and dangerousness become really critical. When during the parent-child separation crisis, I think one of the things that people don't necessarily recognize, so ICE and ORR, neither of them, there's no enforcement mechanism, right? Like if they're killing people, if they're denying people medical care, if they're disappearing children into prolonged and indefinite custody, like there are no regulations, right? There's nothing to rely on to enforce any kind of accountability. And so, what was happening?
Like Zweng, what's happening literally right now in the Dilley concentration camp, my words,
Yeah.
in Texas?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, exactly, right? I mean, like the runway has been long and consistent. Like none of this is, so back then we were disappearing kids, separating them from their families, essentially kidnapping them. We were kidnapping children, and we were putting them in the custody of Health and Human Services. We were using the allegation of future dangerousness to insist on continuing to detain these kids and to detain them in
dangerousness.
Yes, and to detain them on in increasingly restrictive placements. So what that ultimately resulted in was kids being, stripped naked and put in rooms in solitary confinement where they're being forcibly injected with psychotropic drugs. And, this is what's been going on. This is what happens inside of these closed systems. So anyway, what I wanted to actually sort of circle back to is the history of these Section
Well,
1325 and Section 1326 laws.
as you go to take the DeLorean back to the 20th century, I just want to remind people, because
Yeah.
this is not just in the past. When I mentioned the Dilley Center, Immigration Center, this is just what's common to us might not be common to everyone. I put a link in there. Literally, as we're talking right now, in Texas and in California, but specifically Texas, Dilley Center has become a focal point right now because there are individuals there, citizens there, people legally there, who are yelling and crying and saying, we haven't been fed, we've been tortured, we've been beat up. And they're recording the sounds of children from outside the center. And so they just rounded up all these brown people and dumped them in California and Texas in the center. So what Zweng is describing is literally happening right now. Sorry for that little
No,
aside, Zweng.
no. I mean, again, I hate to appear sort of desensitized to all of this. It's just, it's not new. I mean, this has been going on relentlessly for quite a long time. I
And you said you wanted, okay, so yeah, Zwang is the most Zwang is and my wife are like some of the most empathetic people. They cry when they look at a butterfly, right? But like once you're in this situation, you have to, like, it's not like we're not casually saying this, but like you just have to, you know this. You're not surprised by this.
I'm not, of course, I'm not surprised by this. Like, this was, look, like you, I've been subjected to a lot of attacks on my personal character on account of the fact that I, quote unquote, defend criminal immigrants, right? And my response to that has always been, sure, yeah, I'm an empathetic person and I have an understanding of the social construction of criminality and blah, blah, blah. All that is true. But also, right, like, it is precisely in these shadow camps, it is precisely in the context of the vilified, the condemned, right? Like that is where you start to chip away. That is where the erosion of rights and liberties always happens. It's
Always.
always the most oppressed, the most aligned, because we as citizens, we as a population allow these systems to get away with it in those contexts. We don't pay attention. And my response has always been, I'm over here because, believe me, this is where you have to defend the preservation of people's rights and liberties. And you cannot get distracted by these bullshit ideas about the morality of the people to whom these rights attach, right? That's not the point, because this is always the path. This is always the path to authoritarianism. It has been paved this way consistently, without exception.
And also your point is, and speaking my why it's so important, the road to fascism has always been paved by the fascist regime, like you said, exercising their end game on the most marginalized, and usually with immigrants. And if you want to see what they're going to do to you, oh citizens, see what they do to the immigrants first and foremost. And if
Yes.
you allow your government to, I don't know, go after pro-Palestinian activists and kidnap them and detain them, if you allow your government to, I don't know, kidnap brown men and sent them to be tortured in C code. If you, I don't know, allow ICE to terrorize your cities looking for the browns and black folks and Muslims, if you allow your government to do that to any group, that means your government, your fascist government, will do that to you. And that's what we're witnessing right now. Zweng, can I keep interrupting you. You wanted to take this back to the 1920s and the eugenics, the
Yeah,
eugenicists.
I just really quickly, I just happened to glance down at this. This is actually from a declaration that a tremendous historian from UCLA, Dr. Kelly Little Hernandez, submitted in the case that I'm going to circle back to talking about. But there's this incredible quote that I think goes to what you were speaking about earlier with respect to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and sort of underscoring that immigration in this country has always functioned as a program of ethnic cleansing via exclusion and ethnic cleansing via interior policing and rounding up and expulsion, right? So anyway, so speaking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, she says, The act was a more restricted measure than demanded by hardline Westerners, but as one of the law's staunchest advocates explained, if this law is strictly enforced, it will not be many years before the Chinese race will, in all probability, be extinct in this country. Like, that has always been the function of our immigration system and of our immigration laws, is the ultimate extinction of anybody who is not of the superior white race. Anyway, so speaking of that, I wanted
Remigrate. They're openly saying it now, folks. They're openly saying it. The DHS has tweeted remigration. The DHS has retweeted a post the White House posted in which they appropriated a Japanese artist's beautiful beach with a wave and said this is how America would look after 100 million people are deported. Look at the number, 100 million. The low number of undocumented immigrants is around 11 million. Some people say 15 million. So you should think to yourself, I'm an English major, but even I'm not that bad at math. They said 100 million and they still have that tweet up. What does that mean? Forced ethnic cleansing, to Jessica's point. Please continue.
So, yeah, I was just talking a little bit about Kara and about the fact that during COVID, she essentially decided to try and launch an equal protection challenge to Section 1325 and Section 1326. And as a result of that, she started to delve very, very deeply into the legislative history of these provisions. And it's, it's sort of shameful to say that this was 2020 and we as immigration advocates, right? Like, we as the folks that have been in sort of the bowels of this system for a really long time are only truly starting to connect the dots in terms of the tribal 20s, the eugenics movement, et cetera, and how that has led to the system that we have today. So I reached out to Kara and I kind of asked her to educate me a little bit. And it is truly disgusting. It's like
I'm not shocked. I know people say I should be shocked. We've been saying it for years. Eugenicists, white supremacists, people thought we were crazy. Take it away, Zweng. I'm not going to be shocked. I promise. I think other people will be.
Okay, so taking the DeLorean back, as you always like to say, right? We've got, 1924, there's something called the National Origins Act. That is the genesis. That is where the quota system originates, right? So in 1924, they passed the National Origins Act, and the explicit purpose of the National Origins Act was to restrict Southern and Eastern European migration, right? Like, the whole point was that we only wanted Northern European migration. But there's this conflict at play because they hit a wall of resistance. Congress hits a wall of resistance from the Southwest agribusiness, right? Who are utterly dependent on Mexican migrant labor. Profit, always profit, right? That so they need migrant workers to harvest crops. And so they end up convincing Congress to carve out an exception to the quotas for the Western Hemisphere, right? So 1924, 1925, 1926, like, this continues to be this incredibly contentious issue in Congress where there's this tension between wanting to exclude people coming up across the southern border, but needing the cheap labor, right? And I have to, and you're again, like, this is tribal 20s. So this is the emergence of the KKK. This is the emergence of the eugenics movement. This is sort of where we're solidifying Jim Crow. And I want to read this quote from a man named Clements on the congressional floor, which is, he's lobbying on behalf of the Western agribusiness, right? And he's trying to convince people to continue to exclude Mexican migration from the quota system. And he says, He asks the opponents of unrestricted Mexican immigration to carefully consider one question before voting against it. The question, according to Clements, had nothing to do with Mexicans. It had to do with blacks. The one problem which should give us pause is the Negro problem, explained Clements. I warn you, American business has no conscience. If the Mexican is denied us, the Puerto Rican Negro will come, he cautioned. Knowing his adversary well, Clements baited the nervous nativists of the tribal 20s. Which do you choose, he asked, Mexico's deportable birds of passage or Puerto Rican Negroes who, as citizens, would leave the edge of the U.S. empire to settle within the final frontier of Anglo-America? When once here, always here, warned Clements. The Puerto Rican Negro would pose a continual social problem and a growing menace. You cannot deport them. The only real question, therefore, was whether Congress would open the Anglo-American West to permanent black settlement or make its peace with Mexico's bird of passage. So ultimately, what ends up getting proposed, like the solution that they end up coming up with, is creating an immigration law that essentially allows people to come to the United States, Mexicans, to come to the United States legally. And then once the harvest is complete, you can sweep them up, you can charge them with a crime, and then they can be deported, right? So the architects of Section 1325 and 1326, the primary so this becomes encoded in the Undesirable Aliens Act of 1929, right? Like that's the genesis of Section 1325 and 1326. And the primary, and it's explicitly passed on the basis of eugenics and race. And it's almost word for word the same law that we have now that still exists on the books, right? It's some of the only laws that carried over from that era. So there were 5 primary architects of this law, right? And there's one they were all KKK members. They were all leading eugenicists. And there's one in particular that I think is really worth zeroing in on. He's a fellow named Dr. Harry Laughlin. And it turns out that the House of Representatives for about 10 years had their own eugenicist on retainer. And that's who this Dr. Harry Laughlin is, right? So he comes in and he does all these presentations during congressional hearings. And he talks about having the necessity of immigration being a matter of blood and biology. He talks about deportation as the quote, the final selection, right? This is 1929. Like, we're not far off from 1930s fascist Nazi Germany, right? So he becomes the author of the model sterilization laws that Nazi Germany adopts several years later. And he receives a prize from the Third Reich in 1936 because they credited him for many of the theories that they implemented during the Holocaust. Like, when we talk about the connection between our modern day immigration regime, right? Like, and fascism and Nazism and Nazi Germany. These are not abstract, attenuated connections, right? I mean, these are systems that have bounced back and forth off of one another in perpetuity. And again,
and as I know someone's saying it, that whoever's been watching Left Hook, I've been saying it for a long time. For those who don't know about American history, is that the Nazis were so enamored by our efficient system of cruelty against, particularly, but not exclusively, black bodies.
Native Americans, immigration.
Native Americans, black bodies, immigrants. They're like, this is amazing. Look at what these white races have. We got to learn from it. And furthermore, now we're learning, thanks to Jessica, is they awarded our leading eugenicists and said, thank you. We could not have done it without you. You set the template. We just perfected it.
And these are people that designed and implemented the same laws that we are using today, the exact same laws that we are using today, right? That make up 70% of our federal criminal prosecutions. And so I just want people to put that in context and keep that in mind when you hear the rhetoric about why is ICE necessary? ICE is necessary because we have to go root out in the interior, right? We need to domestically root out all of these criminal aliens, right? Like it's this concept of criminality that people miss as being the thing that links all of these things together. And like we've developed a much better conscientiousness around the criminal legal system, around its, how the how slavery became the new Jim Crow, and how, the connections to mass incarceration, right? Like, we've started to carve that out, and it's making its way into the more predominant public discourse. But I think what people need to understand is that system has been linked up with the immigration system. And so when we reinforce this rhetoric, Obama was in many ways the worst offender of this, right? Like, we're not going to go after children. We're going to go after criminal aliens. Like, the reason that ICE is necessary, the reason that detention is necessary, criminal aliens, right? This is the thing. No Democrat has ever, not even been willing. I'm not even talking about being willing to touch it. Like, they have all propped it up. They've all perpetuated it,
The
right?
entire system has funded it.
Always. And it has always been because there's been an understanding that in the American public, we love punishment. We love excessive punishment. We are a punitive society. And so as long as you can couch this rhetoric in, in this construct of criminality, that's how we are where we are today, right? And the connections aren't subtle. We have to start thinking about, we've done a tremendous amount of work as far as developing our understanding in some of these different silos, and now we really need to start to think about how they all link up, and what are the constructs and what are the concepts that leadership has relied on to dupe us all into believing that this system is necessary and that we need to support it.
And to connect the dots, and you keep saying how, these ideas ricochet off each other. One analogy is authoritarian birds of a feather flock together. In
Mhm.
Holocaust Remembrance Day, folks, like I said, for those who are joining us late, nearly 2,200 people. When I went to Auschwitz during the first Trump administration, we were talking about the dehumanizing language that Trump was using at that time and promoting the anti-immigrant conspiracy theories. Our tour guide, whose grandfather had survived, and that's why he volunteers, leaned in and said, "I'm paying attention to your conversation. That's how it starts. That's how it begins,
Yep.
through language, through
Yep.
dehumanization.
Yep.
And look at what they called the Muslims, the Palestinians, the Latinos, the undocumented immigrants, invaders, criminals,
Mhm.
rapists, fifth
Mhm.
column. They'll never blend. They'll outbreed us." That's what they said against the Irish, against the Italians, against Mexicans. What did they call them in the 21st century? Terrorists, domestic
Yep.
terrorists. What did they call Renee Nicole Good and Alex Preddy after they murdered them? Domestic
Sure.
terrorists. And the
Yep.
gun that Democrats and Republicans loaded and gave to Donald Trump to go after the immigrants and black people because they were too afraid to be seen as weak on crime and weak on immigration and weak on Muslims and terrorists.
It's
That
always
gun,
fear. It's always the fear and the dangerousness of these predatory individuals, right? Yeah.
and now it has been turned against us. I am horrifically late to Dr. Stephen Hassan, who will be on in 5 minutes, and he's been waiting patiently. I kept you 5 minutes longer. This is my old friend, Jessica Zweng. She is doing the Lord's work. She has been helping immigrants and marginalized communities for 20 years. We went to law school together. One of us actually paid attention. The other of us, like me, obviously did not. Zweng used to work at the Florence Project, where she was a staff attorney, and the Florence Project has been on this since the 90s, even before ICE, working inside ICE-operated detention centers, and literally trying to not just work on reform and policies, but help those individuals and those families who have been detained. And currently, taking that experience, Zweng is now working on some of the most sophisticated, prolonged, and complex parent and child separation cases, both here and abroad. And now she's investigating capital defense work and trying to contextualize multi-generational stories and histories in order to develop counter narratives to cruel and excessive punishments. And the narratives are important, folks, because it all begins with the story. Who's the villain? Who's the hero? Currently, Alex Preddy and Renee Nicole Good are the villains. This is why when you enable a fascist regime to kidnap pro-Palestinian activists, El Salvadorans, black folks, eventually that fascist regime turns on you, white America. Jessica hates doing a video We finally convinced her. How do you think she did? I've been saying do this. She said, I'm like, you have a wealth of information. She was nervous at first, but once she got
I'm
cracking,
so
uh,
nervous.
so if you want her to come back and explain this, please do. 2,300 people. That's fantastic for the left hook. Thank you all for watching. People are asking, when will this be on? Inshallah, this will be on later tonight, folks. I have like 800 kids, and I have to talk to Dr. Stephen Hassan, and then I have to like work out not to die. So this will be on inshallah in the evening. I will try my best. I'll get this on. We also had a fantastic conversation with two members of the Union Theological Seminary about how fascism attacks education. So we're talking about how fascism attacks immigrants, how fascism attacks culture and education. I have Steve Hassan on in 2 minutes. Fantastic. Dr. Stephen Hassan has spent his life researching cults, how to deprogram cult members, and he wrote this book in the first Trump administration about the cult of Trump. And currently, we're suffering from mass psychosis. That's what fascism does. It's mass psychosis, and then you have to deprogram a nation from its mass psychosis. And it's mass psychosis that sees immigrants and people of color as villains and terrorists, and meanwhile celebrates people like Elon Musk, who is a eugenicist. I'll have him on in 2 minutes, but before I do, Zwang, I'm going to ask you to do something that you're terrible at. But
Oh God, don't ask me to promote myself. Oh,
fortune favors the
absolutely not.
bold. Fortune favors the bold. The spotlight is on you. The time has come. I want you to flex, dig deep, promote yourself, Jessica Zweng.
I don't have anything to shamelessly promote. What I will say is,
You're already failing. Promote yourself, Jessica Zweng.
I will promote myself as an example of a person who is doing things that make me deeply, deeply uncomfortable in an effort to meet this moment, right? I will say that I am in the process of developing something like a consortium or an initiative that is very much around this idea of challenging specifically this narrative. So maybe you can have me back on in a wee bit of time, and I will be able to disclose more details about what we're cooking up then. Until then, I would refer people to organizations like the Florence and Immigrant Refugee Rights Project, all of the legal services organizations that are filling the gap in terms of what happens once folks are rounded up and detained and in ICE custody. And I would implore everybody to start thinking about your own relationship to personal risk and how ethical systems change, and how it is always a function of the evolving standards of decency and morality in a society, and putting extraordinary pressure through whatever means you feel well suited to bring to bear.
I mean, that was very good. You did well. Very cryptic, which I like, as Omar said. But it did. You wet our beaks, and it seems like
You
you're.
want me to shamelessly promote you instead?
No.
Juan
You're
is
getting the
running a
event.
terrible capitalist special, a New Year's special, $3.75 for life if you can afford it. If you can't, everything is free. Nothing's behind a paywall. He's got 800 children. He has to support them. What did I?
That was very good. That was very well done. She's exactly right. Thank you for doing that for me. It's $3.75 for the next 4 days. I have Stephen Hassan on. He's been waiting. Thank you, Stephen. Just give me 5 minutes. And what Zweng seems like what she's saying, what she's teasing out, that she's assembling the ethnic legal avengers, which is what we need. But come back on anytime if you can, please. She's like, someone said, she's got your number. This is what happens when you've known someone for 20 years. Sadly, it's true.
It's true.
And 3 cats. Yeah, for those who are asking, Billu came back last night after 5.5 days. It's
I'm
remarkable.
so happy.
I have this guy, poor guy, he's traumatized. He's sneezing. I don't know how he survived. For those who don't know, there was a snowstorm here. There still is snow. I don't know. I'm just happy. He came back. I don't know how he survived. We're all very happy. 2,300 people are watching. We'll have this up. Thank you, Jessica. Come back and before then, come back because people unfortunately don't know. And let's talk about CBP next time. We talked about ICE, but I think people need to really understand CBP and how they've been operating. So I'll bring Jessica on. And also, we got her on Substack at Jessica Zweng. So what you should do, Zweng, is nothing is stopping you from doing this. Just post some stuff on Substack. People have already subscribed to you. So put a photo, a normal human photo, on your icon. Put a small bio, copy paste your bio, and then you could just post content.
there's a lot of shit going on out here, man.
It's easy. Help me help you get
All
paid, woman.
right, all right,
Just
all
do it.
right.
All right. All right. Thank you all for watching. Come back in 2 minutes. Stephen Hassan, I was supposed to have him at 4 o'clock. Thank you all for watching. Thank you, Zwing. Everyone,
Thanks for
take
your
care,
time.
be kind, be informed, and please don't be a fascist.